We're going to now approach those difficult tasks, dimensions and balloons. So dimensions and balloons, like I said, are they're very expensive in terms of level of effort. And that's simply because when do I apply a dimension? And for me to do it, manually, if I select the dimension tool here, I have to select geometry within my views. So as I hover over geometry, different things are going to highlight. So how do you do that programmatically? How do you do that if you can't see the limits of the geometry? If you can't see an edge or a point or a plane or anything like that, how can you place a dimension? How do you identify that? This is what I'm saying. It's very easy for a human being to do that because they can process that logic a lot easier. I know that an overall height dimension is going to go from the top of the geometry to the bottom of the geometry. But how do you tell code to do that? It's a little bit more challenging. Similarly, if I want to place balloons, how do I know where the leader of that balloon needs to be? How do I ensure that the balloons aren't interfering with one another, that they're not overrunning each other? How do I make sure that they're at the right angle and they're lined up? How do I know that they're not doing something like this where they're interfering? So you have to do a lot of different calculations, and you have to prepare your 3D models ahead of time, so that way you can interrogate those models to understand where those locations are at. Okay. So going back over to the PowerPoint here real quick, I've broken those things down into different methodologies that I use in order to do that. So those of you, I think I've talked about this in some of my previous webinars, is about attributes. Now, attributes inside of Inventor, it's a mechanism to tag geometry, so that way we can recall it. So I can use the attribute manager within my code in order to interrogate a model to find edges and vertices and faces and things like that that have a tag on them, so that way I can place dimensions or even balloons. So it's a means for us to identify where that geometry is ahead of time in a predictable manner, as opposed to manually identifying where those are and then selecting them using the manual tools for generating a drawing. Okay, so what does that look like? Going back over to Inventor here, if I go to a model, there's a couple of different ways that I can create attributes. Now, if you're using iLogic, if I just go into this iLogic code here and I open up my snippets, we have a means of working with attributes. I think iLogic assemblies, add, where is that at? Relationships here. These are constraints, components, features. There is a means within here to be able to, I take that back. It's not even in there. It's here. If we right click, I think if we right click here, we have a means to be able to place an attribute on here, or selection, add an attribute. There's a way to do that here inside of Inventor, where you can place that. I personally try to use a tool called the Attribute Helper, and this is a free download. I think in one of my previous webinars I identified where you can download this, but if you do a Google search for Inventor Attribute Helper, you'll be able to get the download for free, and you can apply it. But essentially what it allows me to do is it allows me to tag different information on my model. Okay, so once the Attribute Helper is open up, I can right click and I say, okay, I can add an attribute set. I can give this a name, and then if it's a common name, or if it's a name that I know of, then within my code, I can then go through the process of identifying where those attributes are. Okay, so let's see here. For my balloons, let's go looking into the balloon logic here, which is, like I said, far more complicated. There's a lot more going on here in terms of what I need to do to place a balloon. I need to do a couple of different things. To place a balloon, first I need to identify, here we go, this method right here. First I need to identify, oh, it's not going to give me the help. I need to identify the different points as to where the leader is going to be connected to, and then of course, where is the balloon going to be located at. So if I have those 2 points, then I can place a balloon. So first point is where the balloon will be placed. And then the last point, and I've identified this in my comments here, is the last point added to the array. This is where the balloon leader attachment point is. So it has to be the last. There's a specific order to creating balloons. The first point is where the balloon will be. The last point will always be where the attachment point is, okay? So I'm going through the process of identifying through calculation based upon the midpoint of some geometry and then offsetting from that midpoint of where the balloon should be. And then I'm identifying through my geometry intent using my attribute manager right here. So I'm using my attribute manager to find any attributes on any of the geometry that have the tag called balloon. Once it gathers that information, it iterates through my assembly to find those. Then it runs this method down here in order to place the balloon using that original point that as reference. So that's how I'm identifying where the balloons need to go. I'm interrogating the assembly, this assembly. I'm finding where the attributes are at, and then I'm using that point. So if that attribute point is there, I'm doing a calculation to offset my balloon to the left and then down a little bit, to the left and down, to the left and down a little bit of where that balloon goes, and then I'm coming back and then I'm providing the attachment point. And then I'm just using the normal inventor behavior to fill in the item number relative to the item number here in my parts list. So I'm not doing anything special there. I'm letting inventor manage that automatically. I'm just pointing out where should the balloon be and where should the attachment point be. Because if I move this attachment point to something else, that item number automatically updates. So I don't need to worry about providing that. I just need to provide the geometry, and then inventor takes care of everything for me, okay? So that's balloons. The last one here, dimensions. Now dimensions work a little bit different. I don't use, in this particular example, I did not use attributes or the attribute manager to identify geometry, simply because I wanted to try a number of different ways for demonstration purposes to help you guys as end users of what are my options? What can I do? Some methods may work better in some situations as opposed to others, but if you don't know what its capabilities are, you'll never be able to make that rational decision. So in terms of dimensions, I use work points within the assembly to identify where I want to place dimensions.